China, a country with a massive population, ancient history, and quite unique traditions that might seem unusual to Europeans. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. It would really help me out. So let's delve into 10 interesting facts about China. Once the spouse of Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip, stated that the Chinese are willing to eat anything with 4 legs except a table, anything that flies except an airplane, and anything that swims except a submarine. But is it true that the Chinese consume insects and other exotic foods like cockroaches, beetles, locusts, spiders, and scorpions? You've probably heard that one version of the coronavirus pandemic started from a market in Wuhan, where seafood and live animals like snakes and bats were sold. China does indeed have a long history of including insects in their diet. Preparing insects for consumption has become quite advanced in most Chinese communities compared to other parts of the world. Centuries of refinement have led many Chinese provinces to engage in insect farming and maintain a constant supply of edible insects. Almost every Chinese province has its favorite traditional insect delicacy, and most of these dishes are prevalent in major cities. Finding crunchy bee larvae, cockroaches, and other insects on the streets of Beijing is no longer considered strange. In fact, the existence of markets selling exotic items like flying bats and even tiger meat doesn't necessarily reflect the popularity of such foods among the Chinese population. Dishes made from tiger meat, for instance, are mainly affordable for the very wealthy who have grown tired of the ordinary fare. The middle class generally doesn't approve of such delicacies. Furthermore, much of the street food is aimed at tourists. On the other hand, the global population is constantly growing. By 2050, it's projected to reach nearly 11 billion, and by 2100, approximately 11 billion people. Feeding them all with animal meat, especially from cows, pigs, and sheep, would require extensive resources, including feed, water, and land. Researchers believe that alternative protein sources are crucial. This led scientists from Asia, such as South Korea, to develop meat substitutes derived from sugar and proteins extracted from the bodies of mealworms, the larval form of large meal beetles. Therefore, it's likely that in the future, many of us will often indulge in such intriguing food options. From our school days, we remember that the Huns swept across Europe with fire and the sword. During that time, even the Pope referred to the Hun leader Attila as the Scourge of God. However, when it comes to China's history, it was the nomadic tribes that left a more significant impact. You may have heard that the Great Wall of China was built as a defense against these nomads, but when it failed to offer protection, the Chinese devised various other strategies. For instance, they hired warring nomadic tribes to defend their borders, even resettling some within China itself. However, this yielded limited success. In the 8th century, the nomadic tribes, known as Tanguts, not only conquered China, but also established their own dynasty there. In the 13th century, the Mongols followed suit, led by Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, who incorporated China into the Mongol Empire and founded the Yuan dynasty on Chinese soil. Even in times when firearms were invented, mounted warriors no longer posed a significant threat. In the 17th century, the Manchus, not the nomads, captured China and established a new ruling dynasty. How did these relatively backward nomads manage to conquer one of the world's oldest and most advanced civilizations, with a population 100 times larger? It was essentially due to a series of internal political crises in China. The decayed and corrupt ruling class of China was drowning in endless peasant revolts. Sensing their impending downfall, the Ming rulers turned to the Manchus, who possessed a formidable military force, for assistance. This decision proved to be their undoing. In 1629, Manchu military units invaded China, capturing several cities. Eventually, even Beijing fell. Over the next 3 centuries, China's progress was stunted. But there were also positive outcomes. Under Manchu rule, the Chinese Empire expanded significantly. The Mongolian territories were captured, and eastern Turkestan, a part of Central Asia, was also annexed. Since then, the Manchus became the most privileged group in China. For instance, taxes collected from the Chinese were not going towards the conquerors. However, something quite intriguing happened. The Manchu dynasty started concealing information about the outside world from the Chinese themselves. By the 18th century, they expelled all foreigners from the country. They even prohibited the activities of Christian missionaries, closed churches, and deported adherents of Christianity beyond China's borders. The Chinese were forbidden to build large seafaring ships and to import foreign literature. Additionally, a massive barrier, stretching over 1,000 kilometers, was erected on the southern border using ditches and trees. This barrier, so-called, was created to prevent the population from interacting with European sailors. The Chinese were told that the entire external world was composed of wild barbarians who had not yet embraced the true, namely Chinese culture. When Europeans, particularly the British, attempted to open China's market for their trade using weapons and powerful ships, it led to the First Opium War. The Manchu emperors presented this to their Chinese subjects as a victory over pirates. However, in reality, the treaty recognized China's devastating defeat, and the British acquired Hong Kong and opened 5 crucial ports in China for free trade. China was compelled to pay a substantial indemnity of $15 million, which equates to approximately $21 million modern dollars, to the British. British opium also became widely prevalent in China. But what's most intriguing is that some Manchus, or more precisely, representatives of the Manchu aristocracy, were well aware of their position in the world. They possessed knowledge about the outside world and understood that their state was not the sole bearer of civilization. Diplomatic correspondence in the country was exclusively conducted in the Manchu language and remained inaccessible to Chinese officials. Essentially, China's Manchu elite didn't even believe their own propaganda. It is considered that Chinese history spans 7 millennia, dating back to around the 5th millennium before the Common Era. A third of its history is occupied by the era of ancient Chinese civilization. But is this really the case? Doubts about the exceptional antiquity of Chinese civilization were expressed by the Chinese themselves for a long time. The notions of independence and deep antiquity, alongside China's consistent superiority over its neighbors, were traditionally seen as self-evident. China, being the central state, was surrounded by barbaric countries. These barbarians presented tributes, used the Chinese calendar, and coordinated the appointment of rulers with the Chinese emperor. But was it truly so? Let's discuss this without conspiracy theories or unscientific ideas. In the 20th century, Chinese historian Gu Digan, during a time when Western thought and contemporary trends in European science and technology were penetrating China, raised questions about the 5,000-year history of Chinese civilization. He managed to halve its duration. For instance, he argued that Yu the Great, one of the ancient mythical rulers in China who was believed to have controlled the Great Flood, was not a real person, but merely a river totem. It turns out that many Chinese dynasties employed ancient mythology to enhance their status and authority, or to justify the subjugation of smaller realms. Imperial unity demanded a myth of a primordial ruler, like Yu the Great. In reality, the majority of ordinary Chinese had no understanding of ancient dynasties. Research has led scholars to conclude that ancient people considered their immediate ancestor as the founder of their lineage. The dynasty's mythical progenitors didn't actually exist, as evidenced by their appearances in later sources. This implies that for centuries the Chinese tried to artificially make their history seem more ancient. Now the Chinese themselves have begun to question their ancient history. However, the discussions surrounding the ancient period of history have shaped principles of scholarly interaction still practiced in China's academic circles today. But besides the Great Wall and exotic cuisine, you probably remember the Silk Road. This is the conventional name for a trade route that connected Asia to the Mediterranean Sea, meaning Europe. Along this road, caravans journeyed for 250 days to a year. However, did you know that this route operated even during the Middle Ages? According to travelers' accounts from Asia at the end of the 15th century, the pace of trade had even increased. Yet the key markets weren't typically located in the harbors along the Chinese Pacific coast. They were thousands of kilometers away, situated on the Iberian Peninsula. As Europe experienced economic growth in the latter half of the 15th century, the demand for luxury goods surged. Vast reserves of riches from the New World were primarily sent to Spain, particularly Seville. Gold and silver were stored like grain in customs, prompting the construction of new buildings capable of holding even larger quantities of goods for proper taxation. Did you ever suspect that this route continued to function in one way or another, even in the 19th century? For instance, British businessman William Knox Darcy initiated explorations for oil reserves in Persia, now Iran, for further transportation of the black gold. He employed a section of the once called Great Silk Road. The story of this road doesn't conclude there. In our time, China's President Xi Jinping, in September 2013, proposed the concept of the New Silk Road, under the slogan, "One Belt, One Road." This is a comprehensive strategy that includes the Belt and Road Initiative and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. It envisions the creation of an extensive network of infrastructure along the path from China's western borders through Central Asian countries and Iran to Europe. It's not just a revival of the Silk Road, but its expansion. Now it encompasses railways, ports, pipelines that unite Africa, Southeast Asia, and Europe. In the 20th century, China was an incredibly impoverished country. A significant humanitarian catastrophe occurred in 1950, marking one of the largest of the 20th century. A devastating famine swept across the country, claiming the lives of 10 to 40 million Chinese. However, in the late 1970s, Deng Xiaoping ascended to power and implemented reforms that forever transformed China. Deng Xiaoping essentially conveyed the following message to foreign investors: "You have the capital, and we have the inexpensive workforce." The plan was rather straightforward. Western companies were required to construct factories and manufacturing facilities using their funds. Simultaneously, they were to exclusively employ local labor and even enjoy tax exemptions for a certain period. This innovative approach meant that Communist China gained not only infrastructure, but also employment opportunities for its population. In 1979, diplomatic relations with the United States were restored, and American companies began actively investing in the Chinese economy. They were drawn in by the combination of cheap labor and low costs. Nevertheless, what's particularly interesting is that today, setting up production in China isn't as inexpensive as it once was. Far from it. The reality is that the Chinese labor force's wages increase annually by around 15–18%, while the American workers' wages increase by a mere 3% per year. Additionally, the rising costs include industrial electricity expenses, which exceed those in the USA. Furthermore, transportation costs for goods manufactured in China have become exorbitant. Consequently, not only foreign companies, but also Chinese citizens are fleeing. In 2008, around 360 wealthy Chinese millionaires emigrated to the United States. Just 4 years later, over 6,000 affluent Chinese individuals had established themselves in the U.S. From 2011 to 2012, a total of 105 manufacturing facilities were relocated from China. For comparison, only 8 factories were moved out of India during the same period, and just 1 from Brazil. This suggests a reversal of capital flow, which used to pour into China but is now also flowing outward, particularly to the U.S. This shift has contributed to a reduction of 1 million unemployed individuals, thanks to China. The notion of China as the world's factory has transformed. Chinese citizens are now focusing on high-tech production. Therefore, they require a labor force that comes at a higher cost. Yet people are leaving this country due to its autocratic nature. On the other hand, China has managed to accumulate vast currency reserves, enabling it not only to acquire assets worldwide, but also to purchase the food it lacks. During those famine-stricken times before the era of Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese government, in an attempt to curb the surging population growth and alleviate hunger, introduced the one family, one child policy. This policy significantly raised the living standards. Initially, authorities announced that this restriction would remain in place for around 30 years. The goal was achieved when population growth in the late 1990s was slightly above 1%, which eventually decreased to about 0.5% in the 2010s. However, this policy led to a new set of problems. Women were coerced into having abortions, and sterilizations were performed. Additionally, only one child was permitted to care for elderly parents. As a result, many families resorted to abandoning newborn girls since they faced a more challenging life ahead. This situation became evident when it was realized that the one family, one child policy was causing a significant gender imbalance. Today, there are far more men in China, and a considerable number among them will never be able to marry due to this imbalance. Nonetheless, living standards in China soared compared to the past. In 2013, China partially eased the one-child restriction by allowing families with at least one single-child parent to have 2 children. Yet the problems caused by this policy persisted. Chinese analysts projected that the country's economy would lose more than 67 million workers due to retirement within several decades. The nation is rapidly aging. As of now, the number of elderly individuals stands at 110 million, and by 2030, it is expected to rise to 210 million, constituting a quarter of the population. In 2013, China's total population was 1.357 billion. Currently, it remains uncertain how the allowance to have more than one child will impact these figures. When authorities altered the policy in 2013, they received 1.5 million notifications indicating the desire to have additional children. This figure was considerably lower than expected. Even rural Chinese citizens are not hastening to start larger families, as it entails substantial expenses. Some demographers and economists argue that permitting the birth of 2 children won't prevent the impending workforce crisis. Chinese couples are marrying later or choosing not to start families at all, mainly due to the escalating cost of living in China, which increases significantly each year. We all remember that China was long associated solely with cheap counterfeits of everything imaginable. However, the Chinese have learned to copy not only branded goods, but also entire cities. Take, for example, the scaled-down replica of Paris, located not far from Shanghai in a town called Tiangucheng. Constructed in 2007, this city is a miniature copy of Paris, featuring a petite 110-meter Eiffel Tower, small-scale Champs-Élysées, and a tiny Luxembourg garden. Many residential buildings were also duplicated from Parisian structures. However, this city is considered a ghost town, intended for 10,000 inhabitants, yet only a couple of thousand people live there due to the high prices for this Franco-Chinese style housing. Tourists might find it more rewarding to visit the genuine Paris. Another Shanghai suburb was named Anting, after a German artist. Built in 2006, it was stylized in German architecture and Bavarian charm. Narrow streets, brown-red buildings with pointed roofs and turrets, wide sidewalks, lush greenery, and fountains create an atmosphere reminiscent of ancient Bavarian towns. Anting was designed for 20,000 people, but it also remains largely unpopulated due to the steep real estate prices in China. Intriguingly, even Venice can be found replicated in China. The Chinese constructed their version of Venice in the city of Dalian. It's amusing that stereotypes about China being the world's primary copycat creators persist, yet few recall that the Japanese also effectively appropriated many valuable aspects from ancient China, including writing systems, poetry, bureaucracy, and belief systems. Speaking of the name Confucius, many are familiar with memes featuring his image, usually accompanied by some humorous nonsense. However, Confucius exerted influence not only on contemporary meme culture, but also on the foundation of Chinese statehood. The philosophy of this Chinese thinker revolved around the notion that one's social position, whether high or low, should not be determined by noble birth or wealth. Instead, Confucius emphasized the importance of education and moral virtues in individuals. These qualities were considered a kind of passport to ascend the social hierarchy. In his teachings, Confucius welcomed individuals of any background to become his disciples, acquire the necessary knowledge, and thus become prepared to hold official positions. Despite living in the 6th century before Christ era, Confucius's philosophy has left a lasting impact on China, producing some of the most educated officials in the world. Figures like Deng Xiaoping studied in France and the USSR. In 1998, during the reign of Hu Jintao, China initiated a program of overseas education for the next generation of leaders. Many Chinese politicians pursued education at renowned institutions like Harvard. You've probably heard that Asia is nearly obsessed with final exams, and that places like South Korea even have exams lasting up to 8 hours. This phenomenon, including the intensity of exams, is also a legacy of Confucian philosophy. During the Civil War in China in the 7th century, a rebel army of 40,000 besieged the small town of Yunzhou, which was defended by a garrison of 2,000 soldiers. The fortress commander, Jane, adopted a tactic of sudden sorties. In the course of these maneuvers, his troops managed to seize even the enemy's edible supplies. After 20 days, the besieged defenders ran out of arrows. At this point, the commander ordered his soldiers to create scarecrows, dress them in their own armor, and raise them on sticks above the walls at night. The besiegers, mistaking the scarecrows for live soldiers, shot them with arrows in response, believing it to be another sortie. Eventually, the rebel commander realized this trick and instructed his archers not to shoot at the dark figures that appeared on the walls the following night. They refrained from firing that night. However, this time, instead of scarecrows, real soldiers descended from the walls, launching a truly bloody sortie. Soon, the rebel army, reduced by half due to the casualties, was compelled to retreat from the town. And what interesting facts about China do you know? Share them in the comments. I always enjoy reading them. Moreover, such comments significantly contribute to video promotion. In continuation of this topic, I recommend checking out my episodes about North Korea and ancient Rome. The links will be provided right on the screen. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell icon to stay updated on new episodes. See you soon.